After 13 years of torture, she escaped the cruel alien Baron and took refuge in a human's arms.
The street outside the Dravara 7 Navigation Archive was nearly empty. A fine, cold rain blurred the outlines of the abandoned trade district, softening the harsh edges of broken windows and rusted signs. The air smelled faintly of oil from a nearby repair bay that had been closed for years, but still leaked its stench into the drains. Corinthale stepped out from the reinforced door, locking it twice. Once with the building key, once with the heavy padlock the department had provided when break-ins became common. He had stayed late, as usual. Cataloging old planetary survey maps suited him. He liked the quiet and the predictability. Born on one of the inner colonies, he had moved to Dravara 5 years ago when the Planetary Registry hired him to oversee chart restoration in an archive most people had forgotten existed. He wasn't here for ambition. He was here to avoid attention, to live in a place where no one cared much about his past. His only mission now was to work, keep his apartment, and stay clear of trouble. He adjusted the strap of his bag and scanned the street before heading for the stairwell up to his flat. Rain gathered in the cracks of the cobblestones, glistening under a single, flickering street lamp. Something moved in the mouth of the alley across from him. At first, just a shadow against deeper shadow. Corin slowed. He had learned that sudden movement toward unknown shapes in this district could be read as aggression, so he stopped where he was. The shadow took one step forward. It became a figure, a woman. Her skin had the distinct violet tone of the Zarini Allen bloodline, but there was nothing ceremonial or proud about the way she stood. Rainwater slicked her long, silver-white hair to her neck and shoulders. Her clothing, a crimson silk ceremonial wrap, was barely intact. It clung heavily to her body, torn high along her right thigh, one strap hanging loose over her arm. Her bare feet were cut, leaving faint red streaks on the whetstone. Corin's first instinct was to look away, give her space. But then he caught the way she swayed slightly, as though weighing her options and finding none she liked. From deeper in the alley came muffled laughter, male voices slightly slurred. The tone told him enough. Whoever they were, they had been following her, maybe mocking her escape. Her eyes found his gold, ringed in black. There was no plea in them, but there was calculation, the kind of quick assessment people made when they had learned to read danger in seconds. Corin raised his hands slightly, palms open. "You're bleeding," he said, keeping his tone low and even. "I know." Her voice was steady but rough, as if it hadn't been used much. "I'll stand here until they leave." "They'll follow you out," he replied. "Come upstairs." She shook her head. "No, I know what doors cost." "I don't charge," he said, "and I don't collect." For a few seconds, she didn't move. Rain pattered harder, and the voices behind her shifted, getting closer. She turned slightly toward the open street, then back toward the alley, weighing her options. Finally, she stepped forward and reached for the coat he had unbuttoned. When her fingers brushed his, she tensed, not from fear, he guessed, but because human touch was unfamiliar now. She slipped her arms into the coat and pulled it closed with both hands, shoulders squared as though daring him to say something. They climbed the stairwell. She never touched the railing, and by the third flight, she had to pause, bracing herself against the wall. He waited without comment. He had seen enough in his life to know that forcing help on someone often drove them the other way. Corin unlocked his door. The small apartment beyond was simple. Shelves of rolled star maps, a work table with an aging lamp, a bed pushed under the wall, a narrow cooking area. It smelled of old paper and faint coffee. She stepped inside and scanned the room, not for beauty or comfort, but for signs of danger. She noted the boots lined neatly by the door, the folded shirts on the shelf, the absence of any restraints or weapons. "Corinthale," he said, introducing himself. "Kareth." She gave no surname. She didn't sit. Her eyes tracked to the stove, where he poured soup into a bowl. She hesitated when he offered it, then watched as he tasted a spoonful himself before placing it in front of her. She took the chair nearest the wall, positioning herself so she could see both the door and the window. As she ate, slowly at first, then faster, He noticed the fine white scars on her forearms and ribs where the coat parted. So were long and straight, some jagged. They weren't from accidents. He knew the rumors of the Baron of Tarvek. Few spoke of what went on in the estate on the hill, but the stories that slipped through were enough. 13 years, she would later tell him. 13 years inside. When she finished the soup, she set the spoon down neatly. "I won't be put out at dawn," she said. "You won't be put out at all," Corin replied. "If you want to leave, you leave on your terms." She studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. He brought warm water for her feet. She refused at first, then relented when he made it clear it was just for cleaning the wounds. He worked carefully, removing glass splinters one by one. She didn't flinch, but her eyes stayed on his hands the entire time, checking for any sign of something more. When he finished, he handed her an old shirt. "Dry clothes," he said. "There's a lock on the bathroom door." She took it without a word and went inside. The sound of running water filled the apartment. When she came out, her hair was combed through with her fingers, the shirt hanging to her mid-thigh. She chose the chair again, not the bed. "You can sleep there," Corin said. "I'll keep watch," she answered. He didn't argue. He lay down, knowing she wouldn't sleep until she was ready. As the rain drummed against the window, Kareth sat in the chair, scanning the quiet room. For now, she had a door that closed, a man who didn't smile in the wrong way, and space to decide what came next. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was the first place in years where she could choose when to move. The rain had eased by morning, replaced with a gray light that flattened the streets outside and blurred the outlines of the abandoned storefronts. Corin woke to the quiet scrape of a chair leg on the floor. Kareth was still in the same shirt he had given her, the hem brushing her bare thighs, her hair pulled to one side in a loose knot. She was moving slowly, checking the locks on the windows, the placement of his boots, the view from each angle of the apartment. "You didn't sleep," he said, voice still low from the night. She looked at him, not startled, just aware that he had noticed. "I slept enough." "Which means none at all," he replied, sitting up. "If you're staying here for a while, that has to change." Her eyes flicked toward the door. "I'm not staying. Not like that. I leave when I decide to." "You made that clear," he said, standing. "But you won't make it far if you can't walk." He gestured toward her feet. The swelling had gone down slightly, but the cuts were still open. She didn't answer, which was her way of telling him she wasn't ready to agree, but wouldn't argue either. Corin went to the small stove, heating water for tea. He didn't push questions at her, but there were too many gaps in what little she'd told him. How she got through the city without being stopped, what had happened the night before, why she had risked walking into a human's door after 13 years under someone like the Baron. He knew she expected those questions, but he also knew that if he asked too soon, she would lock down and give him nothing. Kareth moved to the table, standing rather than sitting, scanning the room again. "You live alone?" "Yes." "No family here?" "No family anywhere," he said simply. That seemed to register with her. She stopped scanning the shelves and studied him instead. "Then why help me?" Corin poured tea into 2 cups. "Because someone should have." She looked at the steam rising from her cup but didn't touch it. "And if I had been followed? If someone came to your door for me?" "I'd tell them you're not here," he said. "And I wouldn't let them in." Her gaze narrowed slightly. Not in suspicion, but in calculation. "Most men would say that because they want something. I don't believe in charity." "I don't either," Corin said. "I believe in deciding who I let inside my door. You're here because I chose that, not because I expect you to make it worth my while." She absorbed that, no expression giving away whether she believed him entirely. Finally, she pulled the chair out and sat, her posture still upright, her bare feet tucked back under the chair as if she didn't want to show the wounds again. He pushed her cup toward her. "Drink. It's not a test." She took a small sip, eyes on him the whole time. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it was layered with things unsaid. Corin knew if he didn't address at least one of the missing pieces from last night, it would hang over both of them. "The men in the alley," he said. "Did they follow you from Tarvek Hill?" Her shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly at the name. "They were there when I left. They are dockhands, not guards. Drunk enough to think I was entertainment. Not drunk enough to be slow. You walked all the way from the hill to here," he said. It wasn't a question. I ran most of it, she corrected, as if the detail mattered. I've been invisible a long time, Corn. It's how I survived him. Him. She didn't say the Baron's name again, but it didn't need repeating. What do you need right now? Corn asked. Her answer came quickly. Shoes. Food I can carry. And something I can use if someone tries to stop me. He considered it. I can help with 2 of those. I don't keep weapons here. She gave a faint, humorless smile. I don't need weapons. I just need something sharp enough to change someone's mind. That told him more than any direct confession would have. She didn't want protection. She wanted control over what happened to her next. Corin finished his tea, set the cup down, and reached into the cabinet. He pulled out an old pair of sturdy work shoes, worn but intact. These will do until you can choose your own. She looked at them, then at him. You keep these for guests. I keep these because sometimes I work in places with glass on the floor, he said. She pulled them closer, but didn't put them on yet. I will try them after I wash. He stepped back, giving her space. In the brief quiet that followed, she studied the shelves of maps. You work with charts, she said again, but this time as if she were linking the skill to something in her mind. You spend your time restoring what's been damaged. That's the job, he said. People think jobs like that are boring, she said. They don't see that you learn where every place begins and ends. He gave a small nod. And sometimes you see the places that aren't supposed to exist. She didn't comment, but the line of her mouth shifted slightly, like she understood the weight behind the words. Corin left it there. He didn't ask her why she had survived when others hadn't. He didn't ask what it had cost her to make it to his door. Those questions would come later when she decided to answer them without turning them into weapons against herself. For now, he poured more tea and slid it across the table. You can stay until you decide. No clock running, no death. She held his gaze for several seconds, then finally took the shoes and set them on the floor beside her. Then I'll stay until I decide, she said. And for the first time since she'd stepped into the light of the street lamp the night before, her shoulders eased just enough for him to notice. The rain had stopped by midday, leaving the air heavy and cool. The streets below Corin's apartment were almost quiet, except for the occasional clatter of metal from the dock's 2 districts over. Kareth sat at the table, her bare feet resting near the work shoes he'd given her. She hadn't put them on yet. Instead, she was examining them closely, running her fingertips along the worn leather as if trying to decide whether accepting them meant something she couldn't take back. You can try them on, Corin said from the small counter, where he was slicing bread. I will, she replied. After I finish thinking about the shoes, about whether wearing them means I stay here longer than I want. Corin placed 2 plates on the table. Wearing them means you can walk without cutting your feet again. Nothing else. She studied his face, searching for signs of hidden meaning, but found none. Her eyes shifted to the food, bread, boiled eggs, some dried fruit. You keep more food here than a man who lives alone usually does. I've had visitors before, Corin said. She tilted her head slightly. And did they leave in the morning? He sat opposite her. Some stayed. Some didn't. Kareth broke a piece of bread, chewing slowly. She didn't seem convinced by his answer, but she let it go. Do you ever ask where they came from? Only if they want to tell me, Corin replied. Her gaze fixed on him for a moment, then drifted toward the window. She took another bite, swallowed, and asked, Do you want to know where I came from? Yes, he said, but not if telling me costs you more than keeping it. The pause that followed was long enough for him to think she might drop the subject entirely. Then she spoke. 13 years in the Baron's estate. I was taken there when I was 17. At first, I was meant to serve as a ceremonial aide for his guests. Then I became something else to him. Something he didn't name, but everyone understood. Corin didn't interrupt. I learned his moods. I learned how to speak so he'd forget I existed when I needed him to. I learned to watch the way his guards breathed, the way they held their weapons, the times they'd break formation. That's how I knew I could leave last night. Corin kept his voice even. You planned it for a long time. I planned it for years, she said, finishing the bread. I just never thought I'd find an unlocked door that didn't lead to another prison. You think this is another prison? He asked. Her eyes met his. I think I need to wait before deciding what this is. He didn't push. Instead, he reached for the small tin of antiseptic salve and set it on the table. If you're going to put the shoes on, use this first. It'll keep the cuts from getting worse. Kareth eyed the tin, then him. You treat me like a person you expect to see again. That's because I do, Corin said. Her expression didn't change, but her posture shifted just slightly, less rigid, less ready to spring toward the door. She opened the tin, applied the salve without flinching, and pulled the shoes onto her feet. They were a little big, but she laced them tight. You said earlier you've had visitors before, she said, standing and testing her balance in the shoes. Were they all women? No, Corin answered, leaning back in his chair. Some were friends from the registry office. One was an old shipmate from before I came here. And me? What am I? That's for you to decide, he said. Her eyes stayed on him for a long moment before she turned away, looking out the window toward the gray skyline. You don't talk like other men. Is that good or bad? I haven't decided, she said, moving toward the door. Where are you going? Nowhere far, she answered. I need to see if I can walk in these. She paused at the threshold. If I come back, it's because I choose to. If I don't, you don't follow. You already made that rule, Corin reminded her. She gave the smallest nod and stepped out into the hallway. Corin stayed at the table, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading down the stairs. He didn't know if she'd return, but he had a sense she would. Not because she trusted him, not yet, but because she had looked out that window and seen how empty Dravara 7 really was for someone alone. Outside, Kareth walked slowly along the street, each step measured. Her eyes scanned every doorway, every passing figure. She didn't look back toward the building until she reached the corner. She stood there for a few seconds, as if weighing the world beyond against the safety, however temporary, she'd found upstairs. Then she turned back the way she'd come. When she re-entered the apartment, Corin didn't comment. He just moved the chair slightly closer to the stove. Tea's still hot, he said. Kareth sat, this time without the posture of someone ready to bolt. Then I'll stay. For now. And in that moment, he knew she'd begun to see this place as something more than just a stop between escapes. The next morning came without rain, but the sky stayed the same flat gray, the kind that made Dravara 7 streets feel like they existed under a lid. Corin was at the table, reviewing a damaged navigation chart under the soft lamplight, when Kareth emerged from the bathroom. Her silver-white hair was damp, combed back loosely, and she wore the same shirt as before with the hem brushing her mid-thigh. She moved with less stiffness, though her feet still favored the balls instead of the heels, avoiding the deeper cuts. She glanced at the maps spread out before him. You work before eating? I work when I'm awake, Corin said without looking up. She walked closer, leaning her hands on the table's edge. You repair what other people throw away. That's the job, he replied. Most of these maps are from survey missions that were never completed. I put the data back together so someone else can use it. Her eyes lingered on the chart, tracing the fine lines and faded notations. You don't like waste. It's not about waste, he said. It's about keeping something useful alive. She considered that, then shifted her attention to the stove. Do you always keep food in your apartment? Or did you bring it in after I arrived? Corin looked at her, recognizing the question for what it was, not about food, but about whether he had anticipated her staying. I always keep enough for a few days. It's easier than making trips to the market. Her expression didn't give away whether that answer satisfied her. She pulled the shoes from beside the door and sat to lace them, still tightening them enough to keep her feet steady. When she stood, she didn't test them in silence as before. She walked directly to the window and looked down at the street. You said you've had visitors before, she began, picking up the thread from yesterday. Why didn't they stay? Some didn't want to, Corin said. Some stayed until they had somewhere else to go. And you? You never asked them to. No, he replied. I've learned that asking someone to stay can make them leave faster. She turned from the window, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed. You think that applies to me? I think you'll decide for yourself, he said evenly. Kareth studied him for a long moment, then walked back to the table and Saturday. Yesterday, you didn't ask how I got out of the Baron's estate. This morning, you didn't ask where I went when I left here. Don't you want to know? I do, Corin admitted, but I want you to tell me when it's your choice, not because I keep asking until you break. A faint shift crossed her face. Not quite surprise, but something close. Most people can't stand not knowing. I've worked with maps my whole life, he said. Some gaps don't get filled until they're supposed to. Forcing them early ruins the whole picture. She didn't answer right away, instead pulling one of the eggs from the plate and peeling it slowly. The Baron didn't lose people often. The few who tried to run were brought back worse than before. But I knew he was gone 2 days ago, off-world for business. That meant the guards were fewer, and the ones who stayed weren't as sharp. I waited until their shift changed, and the cameras on the north wall cycled. She set the shell aside. I walked out. No alarms. No chase. They'll realize I'm gone, but not yet. You think they'll come looking? They'll decide whether I'm worth the trouble, she said flatly. Most likely, they'll let me vanish. Corin understood the weight in her tone. Letting her vanish was just another way of saying she was disposable. Did you see anyone on the way here? He asked. Enough to know I didn't belong in the open. I kept to the service alleys. She met his eyes. I stopped at your door because you didn't look like someone waiting for a fight. That's rare here. He leaned back in his chair. And if I had been, I would have kept walking, she said simply. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of quiet that didn't feel strained. When they finished, Corin stood and pulled a small cloth bundle from shelf. Bandages, he said, for your feet when you go out again. Kareth took them without argument. I'll go to the market today, she said. Bring back what I need. Need, Corin repeated. Not want. Want can wait, she replied, slipping the bundle into the coat pocket she'd left hanging by the door. Before she stepped out, she hesitated. If I'm not back before dark, don't wait for me. I'll leave the door unlocked until midnight, he said. She studied him for a moment longer, then left. The door closed quietly behind her. Corin sat back at the table, looking at the half-finished chart. He realized that despite her rules and her guarded tone, she had started giving him pieces of her story without him asking. Small pieces, but enough to tell him she hadn't completely decided to disappear. Hours later, when she returned, the coat she wore was dusted with faint grit from the market roads. She carried a small cloth sack, bread, dried meat, a sealed jar of water. She placed them on the counter without explanation. You bought more than you can eat in one day, Corin observed. Her voice was steady. That's the point. I don't want to leave this district again for a while. It was the closest she had come to admitting she intended to stay longer. And he didn't say so out loud, but it was enough for him to know she was beginning to see this place, and maybe him, as something that could last. By the third morning, the rhythm of the apartment had shifted. It wasn't something either of them spoke about, but it was there, the way Kareth now moved from the table to the stove without waiting for him to offer, the way Corin had started leaving the second cup out beside his own without asking if she wanted tea. Small adjustments that didn't feel permanent yet, but felt like the beginnings of something stable. She was at the counter when he came out of the bathroom, sleeves rolled up, cutting bread with a steady hand. You have better knives than the market stalls, she said without looking back at him. They're older, he replied. Kept sharp because I use them. Her gaze flicked toward him, brief but measuring. You keep everything sharp. He didn't answer, and she didn't press. She finished slicing, set the pieces on a plate, and pushed it toward him. They ate in silence for a while, the quiet broken only by the hum of the stove. It was Kareth who eventually spoke. You said before that you had no family anywhere. What? Corin didn't pause over his food. They're gone. Work accident. I was off-world when it happened. She studied his face. And you didn't go back? There was nothing to go back to, he said. That seemed to settle something in her mind. She leaned back slightly. Then you know what it's like to have nothing except what you can carry. I do, he said. Kareth's eyes drifted toward the shelf of maps. You've never left Dravara. 7 since you came here? Not once, he answered. Too many places are worse. Her mouth tightened faintly, but she didn't disagree. Instead, she stood and crossed to the shelf, running her fingers along the rolled charts. How many of these are yours? None, he said. They all belong to the registry. I just repair them. She turned back toward him. You repair what's broken, but you never keep it. The observation was sharp enough to make him pause. That's the job, he repeated. Kareth let it go, returning to her chair. She rested her chin in her hand. eyes on him. When I left the Baron's estate, I didn't know where I'd go. I only knew I had to be somewhere he wouldn't think to look. I thought maybe another city, maybe another planet. Then I saw your building and decided to stop. I still don't know why. Maybe you didn't need to know why yet, Corin said. Maybe, she agreed, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Later that afternoon, she surprised him by asking, "What do you do after work?" "Here." "Yes." I read. "Work on the charts. Sometimes I just watch the street." "That's it. That's enough," he said. She gave a small, almost amused shake of her head. "You don't waste words, do you?" "I don't see the point," he said. "Most people use too many." She didn't comment, but he noticed she stayed closer to the table after that, occasionally glancing toward him when she thought he wasn't looking. By evening, the air had cooled enough for them to keep the windows closed. Kareth moved the chair closer to the stove without asking, the heat catching the damp ends of her hair. Corin worked at the table, copying coordinates, but his focus kept slipping to the sound of her shifting in the chair. "You're quiet tonight," he said eventually. "I'm thinking," she replied. "About leaving?" She hesitated. "About staying. And what that means." He looked at her, but she kept her eyes on the stove. "You can stay as long as you want," he said. "And if I want longer than you expect?" "Then it's longer than I expect," he said simply. She turned toward him finally, studying his face for any sign of hesitation. Finding none, she looked away again, as if the answer had been enough for now. It was a small shift, but he recognized it for what it was. The first time she had allowed the idea of staying to be spoken out loud without pulling it back. The following day was unusually still for Dravara 7. No wind rattled the loose, guttering outside, and the usual clatter from the docks was absent. Corin worked at the table, a half-restored map spread across the worn surface, when Kareth moved from her usual chair to stand beside him. She didn't announce herself, just leaned forward slightly, her hair falling over her shoulder as she studied the chart. "This one is different," she said. "It's older," he replied, keeping his eyes on the delicate ink lines. The coordinates were logged before half the colonies even existed. Her fingers brushed the edge of the parchment. "And you can make sense of it with time," he said. She stayed there, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her. Normally, she kept a measured distance, careful not to stand where he could touch her without permission. This time, she didn't move away when his arm shifted slightly to adjust the map. "What's there?" she asked, pointing at a faint cluster of symbols. "A set of relay stations. Or what's left of them." Kareth was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Did you ever want to see the places on these maps?" "I used to," he admitted. "Not anymore." "Why not?" "Travel changes things. Not always for the better." She considered that, then stepped around the table to his other side. Her hip brushed the edge of the chair as she passed, closer than necessary, but still casual enough to seem unplanned. He caught the flicker of her eyes toward him when she settled beside him, and he understood it wasn't accidental at all. This was her testing the space, seeing if it was safe. He kept his voice even. "Want to try?" "Try what?" "Filling in one of the missing sections," he said, sliding a thin pen toward her. Her gaze lingered on it, then on him before she sat. She picked up the pen, her fingers brushing his as she did. No flinch this time. The contact was brief, but it stayed with him. She worked carefully, copying his precise movements. When the pen slipped, smudging a small line, she frowned. "You don't like mistakes." "They happen," he said. "You correct them and keep going." Her eyes lifted to his. "You really believe that?" "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." For a few seconds, neither moved. Then she set the pen down, pushing the chart slightly toward him. "You finish it," she said. Corin nodded, taking the pen back without breaking eye contact. She stayed beside him, watching as he smoothed the smudge into a cleaner mark. Her shoulder was close enough that their sleeves touched lightly whenever he shifted position. She didn't pull away. Later, when he stood to make tea, she followed him into the narrow kitchen space. The apartment wasn't large, and the two of them in that space meant every movement brushed an elbow or arm. She didn't avoid it. "You move quietly," she said, watching him fill the kettle. "So do you," he replied. "It's useful," she said simply. The kettle began to hum. She leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms. When I was in the estate, I used to imagine what it would be like to stand in a kitchen like this and not be waiting for someone to call me away. I thought it would feel like freedom. Now it just feels strange. You'll get used to it, Corin said. I don't know if I want to get used to it, she admitted. Getting used to things makes you forget they can be taken away. He poured the tea, setting one cup beside her. Or it makes you realize they're worth keeping. She didn't answer right away, just took the cup, her fingers brushing his again as she did. This time, the contact lingered a fraction longer than it needed to. They drank in silence, standing in the small kitchen, close enough that the stillness between them felt heavier than the quiet outside. It wasn't the kind of closeness that demanded anything. It was the kind that waited to see what would happen next. When she finally moved back toward the table, she glanced over her shoulder. "Tomorrow, show me another map," she said. And for the first time since she had arrived, her voice didn't sound like she was preparing to leave. The next day brought a weak morning light through the narrow windows, painting the apartment in muted shades of gray and pale gold. Corin was already awake, checking a batch of old data files on his terminal, when Kareth stepped out from the bathroom. Her hair was damp again, loose over her shoulders, the ends curling slightly from the moisture. She was still wearing the oversized shirt, but now it hung differently. One sleeve pushed up above her elbow, the other slipping low enough to reveal the faint slope of an old scar along her upper arm. She didn't comment on the work he was doing. Instead, she walked to the shelf where the maps were stored, scanning the rolled parchments with slow, deliberate movements. "Which one shows the farthest place you've ever repaired?" she asked. Corin glanced over. A survey of the Orin Belt. Half the relay stations there are gone now. She pulled it from a shelf, carried it to the table, and unrolled it carefully. "Show me where you would go if you could leave here tomorrow." He leaned over the map, pointing to a small cluster of systems on the edge of the chart. "Here, quiet sector. No heavy traffic, no military routes." Her eyes followed his finger. "And if I asked you to take me there?" "I'd ask why," he said. Kareth's gaze stayed on the map. "Because I want to see what it feels like to be somewhere no one knows my name." He watched her closely. "You can have that here. No one here knows you." "That's different," she said. "Here I'm still close enough for him to send someone if he decides to." Corin leaned back slightly. "Do you believe he will?" Her jaw tightened. "I don't know. That's the part that keeps me awake." She rolled the map back up and placed it on the table, but she didn't step away. Instead, she leaned against the edge, her hands resting on either side of the parchment. "You've been waiting for me to decide if I'm staying. I think I've already decided, but I need to know something first." He kept his voice steady. "What? When you let me in that first night, was it because you thought I needed help, or because you saw me as someone to keep?" Corin didn't hesitate. "It was because I didn't want to see you collapse in the street while I stood behind a locked door. That's it. Whether you stayed or left was always going to be your choice." She searched his face for a long time, as if looking for cracks in the answer. Finding none, her shoulders eased, though only slightly. "No one's ever said it like that before. You've been told the opposite too many times," he said. Kareth looked away then toward the window. "When I was inside the estate, I used to make rules for myself. Rules that kept me alive. Never sleep too deeply. Never eat the first thing you're given. Never believe a man when he says you're safe." She looked back at him. "You've already broken that last rule." Corin didn't move. "Do you want me to fix that?" She shook her head slowly. "No. I think I want to see what happens if I let it break." There was a stillness after she said it, the kind that carried weight. She stepped away from the table, moving toward the chair by the stove, but stopped halfway and turned back. "I don't want to talk anymore today. I just want to sit where I can see the door and know it won't open unless I say so." "Then sit," Corin said. She did, curling one leg beneath her, the shirt falling loosely over her thigh. He returned to his work at the table, but his attention kept drifting toward her. Her eyes stayed on the door for a long time, but eventually they closed. Not the alert, half-sleep she'd used before, but something closer to real rest. For the first time since she had arrived, Kareth had chosen to sleep in the same room as him, without keeping a barrier between them. It wasn't a spoken admission of trust, but it didn't need to be. The NXT morning came without the gray heaviness of the previous days. Light slipped between the blinds in thin, bright lines, cutting across the table where Corin sat drinking tea. Kareth was still in the chair by the stove, knees drawn up beneath the oversized shirt. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulder in a soft wave, and for once, she wasn't watching the door. When she stirred, her eyes went not to the exit, but to him. "You didn't leave while I slept," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "You'd notice if I did," he replied. Her gaze held his. "I would." She stood, barefoot, and walked to the table. The tension in her movements was different now. Not the coiled readiness of someone expecting to run, but the careful pacing of someone making a decision they won't take back. She sat across from him, hands flat on the table. "I'm staying." Corin didn't let the moment pass without clarity. "For how long?" "Not until I feel safe," she said, shaking her head slightly. "Because I already do. I'm staying because I want to." He studied her, not questioning the words, just taking in how they changed her posture. The guarded lines in her shoulders were softer. Her voice no longer carried that subtle edge of measuring every sentence for weakness. "What about the Baron?" Corin asked. "If he comes looking..." "He won't," she said firmly. "And if he does, he won't find the same woman he kept. That part of me is gone." They ate breakfast together without the usual pauses. Conversation came easier now. Small things about the weather, the sound of the street below, the stray cat that kept circling the dumpster across the way. Every so often, she'd glance at him, not in suspicion, but in quiet acknowledgement. When the plates were cleared, she walked to the shelf of maps, pulling one at random. She carried it to the table, unrolling it with care. "Show me something," she said. Corin leaned over the chart, pointing to a set of small markings near the edge. "These are uncharted islands on one of the water worlds. Nobody's landed there in decades." She traced the markings with her fingertip. "Then we'll add them to the list." "What list?" "The list of places we might see together," she said without hesitation. It was the first time she had spoken of a future that included both of them. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he folded the map carefully and set it aside. "All right, we'll make a list." That evening, the air cooled early, and he lit the small heater near the stove. Kareth pulled her chair closer to his, not on the other side of the table, but beside him. She didn't say anything, just sat close enough that their arms brushed whenever one of them shifted. After a while, she leaned back, eyes half closed. "I used to think I'd never sit like this. Not with anyone. Not without wondering what they wanted from me." She opened her eyes again, looking at him. "You never asked for anything." "I didn't need to," Corin said. Kareth reached for his hand, then, slowly, deliberately, as if giving him time to pull away. He didn't. Her fingers curled over his, warm and sure. The quiet between them wasn't something to be filled anymore. It was something to be kept. Outside, the city kept its distance, the noise of the docks faint and far away. Inside, the door stayed shut, the lights low, and for the first time in 13 years, Kareth felt certain of where she would wake tomorrow. And Corin, who had built a life around keeping things from falling apart, knew he'd found something he didn't need to fix, only keep. It had been several weeks since Kareth had made her decision to stay. The days had settled into something steady. Corin's work at the table, Kareth's quiet movements around the apartment, shared meals that no longer carried the weight of suspicion. The city outside remained the same, gray, worn, indifferent, but inside, the air was warmer, lighter. That morning, sunlight managed to break through the narrow windows, casting long bars of gold across the floor. Corin was by the stove, turning bread in a pan, when Kareth stepped out from the bedroom. She had been using it more often now, alternating between the bed and the chair by the stove, but last night she had slept beside him without hesitation. Her hair was loose, catching the light, and she was wearing one of his shirts, the hem brushing the top of her thighs. "You're up early," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You were sleeping too well," he answered, glancing over his shoulder. "Didn't want to wake you." She moved to stand beside him, leaning against the counter. "I still hear the streets sometimes in my sleep," she admitted. "But when I wake up here, it's different. It doesn't feel like I need to move." "That's the idea," Corin said. Breakfast was unhurried. They talked about nothing urgent, The market, the weather, a delivery of old charts he expected in the next week. After eating, Kareth stood by the window, watching a stray cat pick its way across the roof across the street. "We could take the maps to the outer district today," she suggested. He shook his head slightly. "Tomorrow. Today, we're not doing anything that takes us out of this room." She looked over her shoulder at him, curious. "Because you decided it? Or because you think I need it?" "Because I want it," he said plainly. Her mouth curved faintly at that, but she didn't answer. Instead, she stepped away from the window and came to stand in front of him. Her hands rested lightly on his chest at first, her eyes searching his face for any flicker of uncertainty. There wasn't any. When she kissed him, it was deliberate. No hesitation, no testing. His hands came up slowly, one settling at her waist, the other brushing along her back. The first few seconds were steady, almost measured, but then her grip on his shirt tightened, pulling him closer. Kareth had always guarded her space, always moved with the kind of precision that kept people at a distance. Now there was none of that. She pressed against him fully, her body warm against his, her breath quickening between kisses. Corin guided her backward toward the table, moving slowly enough to give her every chance to stop. She didn't. When her back touched the edge, she hooked a hand around his neck, keeping him close. Her other hand slid down his arm, fingers curling around his wrist before guiding his palm to her hip. His touch there was careful at first, the way it had been since she'd arrived, but she shifted against him in a way that told him she didn't want careful anymore. Not tonight. The shirt she wore slipped off one shoulder, exposing the faint lines of old scars against the smooth curve of her skin. He brushed his fingertips there, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement, and she met his eyes briefly before leaning in to kiss him again. The kiss deepened, and her hands moved over his back, pulling him tighter against her. When they moved toward the bed, it wasn't hurried. Every step felt deliberate, like they were crossing something that had been waiting for them both. The rest of the night was unbroken by words. Only the sound of their breathing, the soft shift of the sheets, and the closeness that neither of them had allowed themselves with anyone else for a long time. Later, lying together in the quiet, Kareth's head rested against his shoulder, her arm draped across his chest. The window was open just enough to let in the faintest trace of cool air from the street. She shifted slightly, eyes half closed, and said, "You know I'm not leaving now, don't you?" Corin turned his head toward her. "I knew before you did." She gave a quiet, almost amused breath. "Then you waited a long time to hear me say it." "It was worth it," he replied. Outside, the city moved on in its usual indifferent way. Inside, neither of them cared. They had built something here that wasn't fragile anymore. And for the first time, neither Kareth nor Corin was thinking about how long it would last. Only that it would.